Meet my little friends, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Don't see anything? They're all around us. It's yeast, specifically bakers' and brewers' yeast, literally in the air, on us, on things, in us. And they're responsible for some of the tastiest things that you put in your pie hole. Now, as far as recorded history is concerned, the Egyptians were the first to use yeast. So they would have, this wonderful bread. And then instead of Instagram, they had hieroglyphics to brag on their buns. But they thought it was magic. They didn't actually consider that it was a living organism. But logic dictates that people were enjoying the good stuff way before the Egyptians. And it makes me think of the drunk moose of Sweden, because every fall, moose go around eating apples that have fallen from trees. And sometimes they ferment. And it's like apple brandy. They get drunk. They've been caught in trees. Like the Swedish moose, the local deer love my peach tree. They're not yet ripe, but come fall, they've got peach brandy. And I think about early humans if they had such a tree. This would be a party. So it also makes me think that if that's been happening for time immemorial, then humans probably picked up a few apples or peaches and they got themselves a little tipsy and they enjoyed it. And probably the same is true for bread. Because when you mix together some grains and water and just let them sit, this is what happens.
And this is what I mean about the yeast being on everything. If you have organic fruit, and I'm growing grapes here, if you've ever noticed that film on the outside, it just looks like a little hazy, that's yeast. Every little bit of haze is yeast. And if I put this in a little flour and a little water, it would inoculate that mixture and create its own grape-enhanced sourdough starter from the yeast that's on this grape.
And that is essentially a homemade sourdough. Now, my first question, though, is I want to know who the first person was who saw this thing sitting around and decided to put it into their mouth. But that's another question altogether. But it wasn't until 1860 when Louis Pasteur actually looked through a microscope and discovered that yeast was a living organism. And he also demonstrated that it's responsible for fermentation and that wonderful taste that comes from yeast when you're eating bread and you're drinking wine and you're drinking beer. Up until that time, people were working with sourdough. They were taking the natural yeast from the air and allowing it to populate grains and water. And here in the United States, on the frontier, sourdough was a life-giving thing. In fact, cowboys traveled with their own sourdough and they made flapjacks and bread with it. Rumor has it that cowboys kept their sourdough in jars and tucked them under their armpit and slept with them at night to keep them warm on the cold range. Now that's a lot of work to keep something alive, but it's kind of worth it if it's that delicious. That was the American frontier, but back in Europe, they were doing something different. They were living in cities. And bakers would get their yeast from brewers. And it was called the Dutch process. They would get what is called the top coat from the brewing process. And they would use that yeast to populate their bread. And it was sweet and it was tasty and it was delicious, but they had to depend on brewers. They couldn't get it from another source. And some dude in Vienna decided that he was going to brew his beer differently. And he decided to do a bottom fermentation. And it became all the rage. Everyone was doing it. All the brewers were doing bottom fermented yeast beer. And the bakers had to use this yeast. And it stunk. It was bitter. It had hops resin in it, hops particles. And when anybody had one of those loaves of bread, they would say, ew, gross. It was disgusting. And so at that time, all of Europe was doing the Dutch process. And if you are a baker, you know that there's more than one Dutch process. There's also the cocoa process. So I would just like to say to the Dutch, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for making my baking life better. Anyway, these Viennese decided that they were going to try to scavenge yeast from elsewhere in Europe because everyone was doing it. Not everybody was probably in this like hipster trend of bottom fermentation. But what they found out was that it isn't easy to transport fresh yeast long distances without it going. It all died. So they needed something else. So in 1845, the Viennese Bakers Guild held a competition, and they were to award a prize to anyone who could come up with a stand-alone leaven. Anyone. And it turned out Adolf Mautner from St. Mark's Brauerei invented such a thing. So he took, through the brewing process that he knew so well, the full cream yeast that rose to the top, the good stuff, the sweet stuff, not the bitter stuff and weird stuff, and he compressed it into a cake. And there came the Viennese process that allowed bakers to rule out the middleman. Didn't exist, didn't have to go through breweries. They had a yeast of their very own. And that little cake saved the day in Vienna. However, it's still pretty hard to transport. The stuff doesn't last long. It wasn't until World War II when companies like Red Star created dry yeast, a yeast that could travel, and it traveled with soldiers overseas, and they actually made bread in the battlefields. So they got a little taste of home, and we got a yeast that could travel during peace and during war. Now off to Wisconsin to learn a little more. Back in Wisconsin, it's the 1880s, and 3 German immigrants, they partner with a local Milwaukee businessman, and they decide to capitalize on the boom in yeast, everything from brewing to yeast for bread. But they find that one business rises above them all, and it's called Red Star yeast. And it's Red Star that gave us the innovation of dehydrating the yeast so that soldiers could have it in their pockets to bake bread during wartime. But the innovation didn't stop there. Red Star yeast is innovating to this day. Just look at platinum yeast. They're added natural improvers. If you overknead or underknead, platinum is there to hold your hand. You're still gonna have great bread. It gives you a better oven spring. But wait, after it bakes, it also gives it a longer shelf life. All these natural improvers do so much more than make your bread rise. It just makes your bread better. But Red Star yeast has not forgotten their past. You can still get fresh yeast. If you have an old recipe from your grandma that requires cake yeast, fresh yeast, you can get it from Red Star. If you want active dry, if you want rapid rise, Red Star has got you. If you want instant sourdough, Red Star's got you too. And if you are going full organic, guess who's holding your hand? It's always Red Star. And from the very beginning, those German immigrants in Wisconsin were making a beer. And you guessed it, Red Star is still making yeast for the beer trade and for wine. So that, sweet people, is the history of yeast and a little bit about the wonders of Red Star and platinum. Now let's start making some bread.
If you're interested in more in-depth classes, both in person and online, visit sugargliderkitchen.com. Hey, don't forget to punch down those like and subscribe buttons.